quite a privilege and an honor to collaborate on such sessions with Wellspring, quite an esteemed organization. Well, folks, good afternoon. This topic is of particular interest to me. They all are, but this one has a bit more bite, a bit more, I would say, emotion or potency to it. In the years, especially this particular year with COVID, hearing the challenges of caregivers, this particular topic has really come forth in some of our groups and some of the one-on-ones that I provide with caregivers. And I like to say it as all that goes unsaid, and what that actually means or might mean is I find caregivers um, carry a lot of what they might not be able to say, or they themselves don't have the opportunity to say it, or they may not permission themselves to actually put forth that which is on their minds. Sometimes it's at the apprehensions of how it's received, but oftentimes it's because it's hard to even admit it to ourselves what we're actually thinking and feeling when it comes to these subject matters. And you'll see what I'm talking about. I like to address them as hidden thoughts and emotions because in many ways caregivers carry these hidden emotions and thoughts, like I said, because of the either barriers or lack of opportunity for them to be expressed in whatever environment they are. And I'll expand on that a little bit more. We're going to speak to what they might be, what some of the emotions, thoughts, feelings, experiences of caregiving that go unspoken usually are expressed by caregivers that I've supported. Most of these webinars, folks, are not stuff I'm pulling from my education or my knowledge or even my experiences as a caregiver, but actually from experiences of caregivers like yourselves, right? Or how some people like to identify themselves as people who provide a caregiving service or are in a caregiving role. So let's begin. I'll give you a little bit of background on me. And I apologize if you've seen this a few times. I shouldn't apologize just because I'm so proud of it. I've worked in hospice palliative care and grief and bereavement and death and dying and caregiver support for over 30 years. This is my 31st year, I believe, and in multiple domains, folks, in multiple settings across the country, in the US, in Trinidad, across the pond, what have you. And I've seen a lot of death, and inadvertently, I've shared a lot of caregiving experiences. I've spent a lot of time supporting and had the privilege and honor of supporting caregivers in these settings. Some of them have been right here in Southern Ontario and more affluent neighborhoods. Some of them have been with people who experience structural vulnerability, like to see the picture of the gentleman on Bay and King, some with homelessness, aspects in absolute abject poverty, like in India and in Trinidad, and in a multitude of hospice settings across the province. And currently, I said currently I was going to talk about where I am right now, but apparently Jude wants to say something. Folks, this is June Callwood. I had the privilege and honor of meeting her back in the early 90s. I like to make this joke that I haven't changed a bit, but obviously that's not the case, especially with COVID. I've grown much more gray hairs. But why I bring this up is because she taught me something about being a formal caregiver. And that something is presence. I have never felt in my entire life, um, except maybe with my current partner, um, more in the presence of somebody paying attention to my words, to my actions, to my experiences than with June Callwood. She was a phenomenal caregiver. She built 50 social service organizations. She was really a force with which the advocacy for caregivers really grew, and informal and formal caregivers as volunteers in hospice palliative care are honored by the June Callwood Award for their outstanding support and contribution to the community. So I've had quite the opportunities to engage some phenomenal caregivers in my life. Right now, folks, I work a lot with people experiencing structural vulnerability, which is a very different aspect of, or in some ways similar aspect of caregiving, right? The definition of family might be a little bit different. The experiences of caregivers living what we call rough or in structural vulnerability can be quite different, and there might be aspects of even traumatization. Maybe not might most often there's aspects of traumatization. Currently, I teach and provide training and education and policy development and what have you across a number of hospices in Ontario. But I am housed, or I'm based at Kensington Health Center or Kensington Hospice. I work at the hospice in psychosocial support at the bedside and with caregivers and families, but I also have the privilege of working at the long-term care facility or the health center, Kensington Health Center, in the Second Mile Club, where it is a stronger focus on caregiver support and with a bereavement piece, and this is facilitated through one-on-one support or in groups. I want to give a little bit of what can I say, a disclaimer. Everything we're going to talk about today is in the light of COVID, folks. There was a time when we could talk about self-care. Hey, go for a walk, go for a swim, go spend some time at the library, go shopping. There's so many things have colored and changed our engagement of caregiver support because of the pandemic. So I say this sensitively, that it's masked or filtered or supported or referenced with respect to a lot of the challenges we've had with COVID. I find caregivers have really struggled with COVID, and rightfully so, because of a lot of the avenues with which they can dissipate stress or find supports or receive supports from the ministry or social service organizations are either barriered or absent right now, or taxed because of the pandemic. So let's get started with this depiction. I teach a lot by abstract, folks, or I shouldn't say even teach. I share a lot by abstract. I get taught more than I ever teach, a lot by abstract. And I want to speak to this about caregivers, right? And I love this image because so often I hear from caregivers these experiences. I feel beat up. And that's not something you can necessarily say to the person you're caring for, a loved one, a family member. We become very boundaried and focused on the capacity of caregiving for somebody. It's not usually in our right minds to say to somebody who we are caring for, who are carrying the load of living with cancer or dying from cancer, that I feel beat up. But you, in a caregiver group, one-on-one, sometimes just with friends, I hear it so often. I feel beat up. But often as well, and I was talking to a caregiver yesterday, we put on a smile on our faces. We appear brave and strong so as not to burden others with our caregiver taxes and caregiver roles. But if we look deep enough, if we be present like June Caldwood taught, be present enough, we can see the beat up. I personally am a formal caregiver, meaning I work in the field, but I'm also an informal caregiver. I have two older adults at home. One has a tumor in her neck, and one is. My work doesn't end when I go home. I'm also a caregiver for my parents. And oftentimes, straight up, folks, I feel beat up, but I have nowhere really to put that. I have it in my team here, but this is what I do professionally. So I have built-in processes and mechanisms, and I've learned that in the organization. The wonderful organization of Kensington has put those in place. But for informal caregivers out there, in our society, they don't often have a place to put the feeling of beat up, or even admit it, or say it, or even feel it. Oftentimes, they don't even have time or the energy or even the permissioning of themselves. You'll notice these words I'll say over and over again to speak about their beat up, right? And what that means to them. And I put this particular depiction because it reminded me of a caregiver a couple of weeks ago. She flat out said to me, Rami, I feel beat up, but I put a smile on. I put a smile on. And you know what ended up happening? The tears flowed because behind the smile, oftentimes there is that feeling of taxed and overwhelmed, right? And what caregivers often end up having to do is almost carry polarities. I like to call it polarized caregiving. And why I put it in that frame is because the caregiver or person providing caregiving carries the emotion of what is happening to them. At the same time, If most of their focus is on the person they're caring for, let alone an extended family, like, and what have, which most caregivers are. At the same time, they're supporting and sometimes holding and acknowledging the feeling of the person they're caring for. So they're holding almost two states: the compassion and empathy and care for the person they're caring for, right, who's living with cancer, and all the emotions involved for that person, and then their own emotional state. But for so often with caregivers, what do you think takes precedence? What do you think takes priority, or is put as a priority, or is seen as bigger than? Is that of the person we're caring for? Is the person living with cancer? So the caregiver is left holding these, with usually balancing one more than the other. And that emotion oftentimes has nowhere to go. Those thoughts, those experiences have nowhere to go, because as a caregiver, we often deny ourselves our own supports, or we don't find the time, or we don't have the time, or there isn't the opportunity, or we don't know about it, the knowledge of it. And part of what I'm going to do today is share with you what we can do with those emotions and those thoughts and those feelings, and where are the places where we can seek support, right? But I love this depiction because caregivers often are in that state, right? They have a outward face, they have a caregiving face, and then they have the inward face, which is usually silent, invisible, hidden, and not shared, because of a number of reasons I'm going to speak about today. I love this caregiver. I mean, I love all caregivers that I have the privilege of supporting and walk alongside. But she just flat out said it to me. She said, in a group setting, she says, "I feel like a fucking punching bag." And I was taken aback. We were all taken aback because she'd never said the F word before. But she was at a state, folks, where her experience was not only just beaten up, right? Or that she felt beat up. It's that she felt like a punching bag. And she'd say, I feel like everybody's taking swipes at me. I feel like life is taking swipes at me. I have to take care of this, and I have to take care of that, and I have to call the ministry, and I have to call the PSW organization that I can't reach and are not sending me support, and I have to answer the phone downstairs because they're sending food, and I have to answer my partner's calls for help. Just not just a juggling, but she felt like punched all over the face, all over the place, and she couldn't share that particular experience anywhere else. She would only share it in this particular group. And that's where she felt permissioned and safe to share the truest experience of her as a caregiver. She couldn't share it with her family. She couldn't share it with her daughters or sons. She couldn't share it with her husband, or even, the ministry or the social service organization that is supposed to be helping her. She felt like a punching bag. Now, how often do we hear from caregivers that they feel beat up and they feel like a punching bag? Usually caregivers say, yeah, I'm doing what we can, living day by day, doing our best, right? This is what we're doing, taking it day by day. This is the best we can do. I feel a bit tired, but when you get under that, you get behind that piece of paper with a smile on it, you get up behind the masks that caregivers are so good at putting up, right? Whether it's innate compassion and empathy and caregiving ability and style, or just the very fact of the situation necessitating their posture or their role, those statements of expression, feeling like a punching bag, feeling beat up, right? It gives you a sense of what the caregiver might be experiencing. It also, and we'll expand this further in the presentation, it also offers an opportunity to truly get into what a caregiver might be truly experiencing. I said truly twice, truly experiencing, right? And one of the, now, and again, here I'll be reframing it in terms of COVID, one of the most effective right now, especially with the pandemic and a lot of the opportunities for self-care or avenues of self-care, mediums for self-care being thwarted or decreased, is this recognition and awareness of the feeling we're carrying and having a voice, creating a voice for it, and having someone acknowledge it and hold it with you, right? It's one of the most ancient and effective healing practices, is to be heard. And that's what I loved about June Caldwell, is she truly heard me. She truly heard. Why people loved her so much is because of her ability to truly listen, and with her whole body. So any of you out there feel like a punching bag? Any of you have ever felt beat up as a caregiver, where you're just taking it from all sides, and you still have to hang there and take it because it's everything's reliant on you? Yeah. Let's look a little bit more into some of the other experiences that I hear caregivers share. Another caregiver, he said to me, I feel cheated. I feel cheated. I feel cheated out of a summer that I thought we'd be able to spend more time together. I feel cheated out of a holiday season. I feel cheated out of my retirement. I feel cheated, right? And he said he'd never said that to anybody before. He'd never said it in an open environment. And so interestingly enough, these two groups are unrelated. I support multiple groups of caregivers, and these groups are unrelated, meaning people don't necessarily go from one to the next, right? Because one is Wellspring and one is Kensington, although they could, but they don't, right? It's very tribal that way in terms of where we stay. And the next caregiver the following week, the next caregiver group the following week, somebody said the same thing. Another caregiver said, I feel cheated, right? It's this opportunity just to express truly how we feel. But can we say that to anybody else? Somebody and the caregiver said, he said, I can't say this to anybody else because they will say to me, well, you don't have cancer, right? You're going to get up and walk away. You can think about a future without this person or with this person. You're not, how can you say you're being cheated? You have all this. And yet there's a lack of recognition of the very things that have been cheated by that person. I think as a general society, we're uncomfortable with the plight of caregivers because we have all the possibility and potentiality of being a caregiver. And technically, folks, I think most of the planet are caregivers. Like we are all in some way caregiving for something or someone, whether it's a pet or a child or a partner. We're providing some form of care giving. And as a result of that, I think we should be aware and mindful and permission the feelings that come along with that, whatever they may be, especially with the plight of caregivers, which is a national epidemic now in terms of their burnout. This feeling of being a punching bag, being beaten up, and being cheated. And what was I found uplifting, if I can use that in this in this context, about this session was that somebody actually. That's why I love peer support, folks, in terms of group dynamics. Somebody from the group who is also a caregiver just asked him online and said, "What is it like to be cheated?" And then it all started to flow out. Right? It was an opportunity, a portal, a door which with the caregiver in expressing his authentic emotion towards what is happening to his person that he's caregiving for and to his life, that let off the flood of emotions of loss and betrayal and change and anxiety, right? Because there was a space for how he perceived the world as being cheated. I know my parents said it the other day. It's very interesting how perspectives are. They see it a little bit different. They say because we have one of the best healthcare in Canada, they don't necessarily feel cheated. But I feel cheated because I've spent 10 years, and I say this in an open forum, I've spent 10 years supporting two older adults, and it's taken away so much from my life. I lost 10 years of my life, right? I feel like I've lost 10 years of my life. And I'm comfortable saying it now without necessarily the guilt associated with it, because I recognize that is my time, my life, and it's okay to have those feelings, even though it's in reference to something altruistic and benevolent, like caregiving. The importance is that we recognize and become aware of how does the situation make us feel, and it's these taboo hidden emotions, feeling beaten up like a punching bag, being cheated, that are often hidden because it's not okay to say them as a caregiver. Caregivers are often self-imposed perception and the perception of others as being angels. How many times have I heard that? Angels, altruistic, all giving, and what have you. So even that perception and that almost like a bias doesn't allow caregivers to truly express how they feel about a dynamic. Right? And that's above and beyond the superimposed expectations that we have as caregivers. Let's move on. We go a little, don't want to say darker, but a little bit deeper, right? We get into aspects of anger and resentment. Caregivers very often experience a great deal of anger and resentment at a situation that involves their caregiving, involves their time. And that anger and resentment can manifest in a number of different ways. It can be uh, anger at the situation that they find themselves in. It can be anger at the injustice of it all. It could be anger at what's happening to the person they're caring for, resulting in what they have to do for that person. But what's important, I find, is the emotion of anger. Um, I, except in groups and one-on-one, and sometimes in uncontrolled outbursts, right? Or opportunities of what they would address, not myself, opportunities of weakness, as some caregivers say. The anger comes out, the resentment, not necessarily of the person, but folks, in all honesty, sometimes caregivers in closed circles, in safe environments, in safe settings, will say they're resentful of the person for being sick, or resentful of the fact that they have to care for them, even though they love them, even though they're partners or their family, or but those emotions come up. And if we don't have a space for them, if we don't have an opportunity to have them acknowledged and heard, they can fester. They can sit in there. In and of themselves, they're not necessarily bad, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who feels resentment or anger towards their caregiver role or towards the person they're caring for is a bad person, or that they'll do something about that in a negative, destructive way. But that emotion is and I don't want to give it too much away and jump ahead. It's almost a normal emotion to have when something's being taken away from you as a caregiver, right? That's part of that care for the self, to recognize, what are you losing? You're losing time. You're losing a relationship. I've heard caregivers say, I didn't sign up for this, right? And a caregiver can't say that to just anybody. A caregiver can't even sometimes even admit that to themselves. Sometimes in groups or in one-on-one, it's amazing how as caregivers we'll express it. We go quiet, right? We'll say it, I'm angry, or I just, and it comes out almost as a whisper. There's sometimes a bit of guilt and a bit of shame involved in having that emotion. But we have it. Caregivers have it, and I think the main thing is for us to acknowledge it in settings where it would be held in unconditionality and supported, and even sometimes explored, because we can't obviously say it. I mean, some of you have those types of relationships with the person you're caring for, but you can't often say it. You can't really say it to the person you're caring for. So where does it go? It stays within. And my biggest, how can I say, catalyst, personal catalyst in supporting caregivers is that I know from my work in trauma-informed care that emotions, um, expressions of fight or flight, states of fight or flight, and hyperarousal can somaticize and become physical ailments. And I don't share it too much in caregiver groups, um, because caregivers already have enough to deal with. But so often, their aches and pains, their headaches, their what they would classify as depressions. Their even sometimes their autoimmunity can be aspects of somatization of emotions. So I'm not going to create the direct link, but there's definitely a link between these experiences and physical sensations in the body. And that's why I think as caregivers, it's important to explore, to be aware, to acknowledge, to have a place for all our emotions that we experience, as caregivers, as providing caregiving, right? But especially the ones that we would consider taboo, that we consider hidden, that are said in a whisper, right, in a quiet tone under our breath, like resentment, like anger, like feeling like a punching bag. You know, that individual that said she felt like a punching bag was concerned. She'd never say it in public because she didn't want to appear like a victim, right? One person had actually said she was a victim of circumstance. She says, no, I just feel beat up, and I feel like I'm being punched. It doesn't necessarily mean she's victimizing herself. It's just how she's feeling, even physically, right? Let's go to another emotion or a thought pattern. Sometimes I hear from caregivers, and said in a hush, in a whisper almost, um, is that and I say this hopefully in the sensitivity, they think about what it's going to be like when the person dies, right? With the person they're caring for. It has a lot of mixed emotions, but the caregiving is so much, and the loss of their own life is so much, that sometimes they actually have thoughts. And this is how it's usually framed. I can't tell you how often caregivers speak like this, and how often the the language is the same, right? It's like this communal mind of caregivers in some regard. Um, they say it like this. They say, I can't help thinking of what it would be like when they die. And when we ask, like, what do you mean? I said, well, how much I would get of my life back, right? That is said in the shadows. That's not said in bigger circles, but it's not a natural emotion. It's a natural way of thinking, right? Not because they're wishing harm to the person they love and they care about, but because the load of the caregiving is so much on them and taken so much from them. I advocate very strongly, almost over the top, for caregivers because of how much is given by them or taken by them, right? Taken away from them in loss, time, support, joy, love, outings, experiences, life, expectations, all these things, right? And oftentimes caregivers don't acknowledge, don't look at it, don't even permission themselves to feel it because they should be focused on the person they're caring for. But in caregiver support, we wanna do the opposite of that almost, right? We wanna do the polar continuum of that. Is it a recognition of the experience of the caregiver, which can have thoughts such as this, saying, I can't help think about when they die, what it'd be like for me. Or, yeah, I'll be sad, I'll be upset, but I don't know how much longer I can do this, right? And that leads us to actually our next one is time. I've heard from caregivers saying such things as, I don't know how much longer I can do this. This has been going on for a while. One caregiver came on a few weeks ago. She talked about 10 years of caregiving. I'm on my 11th year with my parents, and I often say I don't know how much longer I can do that. I'm getting older. I'm almost 50. I have a child. I don't know how much longer I can do this, let alone some of the caregivers that are supported in our groups. They talk about that. They talk about time. They talk about the time they have left in their lives, right? This session, folks, you might see is really, really focused on the experience of the caregiver. Not in any way trying to take away from the experience of the person living with cancer, but let's acknowledge the experience of the caregiver. And this is one vital part of it: the loss of time of their own life. How much longer can I do this? It's only been 4 months that they got, whoever I'm caring for got diagnosed, and I can't imagine doing this for 10 years, right? Let's acknowledge that. Let's have a space for it. These hidden emotions, these hidden experiences are actually a form, can evolve into a form of trauma and traumatization. And if they don't have a place for them to sit and be made aware of and acknowledged, in many ways embraced, right? Because they're natural, they're normal, except due to the societal influences and our own self-imposed accountabilities and responsibilities, we don't really put them somewhere. We don't really speak them, right? And some caregivers, again, in the hush of the tone, it's amazing when we talk about this stuff in groups or one-on-one, how the tone of the voice and even the body language changes when these topics come up due to shame and guilt and feeling bad for saying them and what have you. Maybe if we had stronger, more expansive, more resourced caregiver supports like at Wellspring and at Kensington, caregivers would have an opportunity to address these feelings early on in the caregiving journey rather than have them wait and harbor and burn out and then come to a point where they have to almost feel like they hide these emotions, these experiences. Several caregivers I've heard from and been walking the path with talk about thinking of the loved one after they've died, right? Thinking of their life after the loved one has died or the family member has died. And you could only imagine the emotions that come from that. Like what would the emotions be for you, do you think? Do you ever think about that? Do you ever think of or allow yourself to think of that and what you might experience in that? What one giver he said to me, he says, I can't help but think about it just because I have to plan for my life. I have to plan for what it might be after the person, the person that he was caring for, his wife, would die. I can't help it. I have to see what's going to happen to my life, right? If she dies, if, right? And she was pretty stable if she dies of cancer. Now, here's an example of where the person isn't even in a trajectory of palliation, right? Isn't even, dying of cancer, is living with cancer, but he couldn't help think of the possibilities in the future. And I've heard that actually from several caregivers. So that journey, what happens? And I personally think in many ways, obviously, that's not something you might talk to about with the person you're providing care for. But I think in many ways, we're I'm not necessarily a biologist or neurologist, but I think we're built that way. We're built to survive, to adapt, to anticipate the future, to look at the future, experience what it might be like, or it could be like, anticipate, plan for, um, adjust before it happens. That's the whole idea behind visualization and preparation, anticipation. That's the whole idea behind anticipatory grief. Look into the future of a loss, a potential loss, and feeling what it might be like now to be prepared for that experience, right? Or even experiencing the losses as they go. Same thing happens with caregivers, and I've heard it quite often from caregivers that I can't help but think, and it's the language and it's so similar. I can't help but think and plan for after, right? One person said it for after. She called it the after, right? What might my life be like? And that's an important piece. And you can see how that's a hidden emotion, a hidden thought, and hidden experience of that kind of thought pattern or that kind of projection. You can't necessarily share that in any circles. And that's what caregivers carry a lot of, right? These hidden, tabooed, suppressed, repressed, ignored, denied, although I don't necessarily believe in denial, denied aspects of the experience of caregiving. And where that often leads folks is to experiences of guilt, right? We did a whole session about a few months ago. It's COVID times. Everything feels like it was a month ago. Things have been going so quickly. As a part of I think the traumatization of the experience of the pandemic of COVID. But we did a whole session on the caregiver experience of guilt. And that's a very common emotion that's associated with hidden emotions. That's actually sometimes the gatekeeper. Guilt or feelings of guilt can shut the door and lock the door for all these hidden emotions. Caregivers, the depth of guilt of saying that, one caregiver said this, right? Hope I say this in a sensitive way. I honestly can't wait till this is all over, right? What they were implying when their loved one either, you know, whatever was, they added a little bit more, whether they lived or died, right? Because they were just so burnt out, so tired. Or if they feel angry and resentment at the situation, or if they feel beaten up, or they feel like a punching bag, or if they feel, you know, planning for a future, what the future might be like, right? And whether it's still with the person who's living with cancer, some of the uh, maybe the barriers or challenges involved of living with a disease that might have progressed and limited aspects of their life, or if the person dies, right? This gatekeeper called guilt um, is almost 99.9% of the time there when we have these hidden emotions. And hidden emotions and experiences, are some of the most authentic of caregiving that I could ever see or have the honor of being with, are boundaried by that experience of guilt. I shouldn't think that. I love them. I care for them. I'm a good person. I'm not a bad person. How can I be having thoughts and feelings like these? How can I be thinking this? How could I be feeling that way? Right? It's not about me. It's about them. It's not about me. It's not about them. The self-denial in caregiving is epidemic, right? And yet they sit somewhere, folks, those emotions, because I see them with caregivers and caregiver groups all the time, right? And I want to tell you, they are normal. And we're going to talk about what we can do with them. What I won't use the word should, but I will. What we, for the most part, should be encouraged to do with them. How's that? How's that sound better? And what oftentimes happens with caregiving, why I say oftentimes, folks, because nobody's the same in terms of caregiving, but we see similarities and generalities and commonalities. What oftentimes happens with caregivers that have had these experiences and thoughts, which is the majority, I would say, or at least the ones that come to us for these supports, is that it becomes a spinning, right? And the spinning is a way of managing what we feel as a result of the caregiving, what we're providing in the care, what we don't want to feel and express, what we want to put away and hide and not let anybody see. And it's almost like it's not a juggling, right? Because the balls don't stay long enough in our hands to actually look at them, but spinning. And caregivers can get confused, lost, paralyzed. I've heard the term paralyzed, but all these multiple emotions happen at the same time. And sometimes caregivers get exhausted. They'll take this emotion, and it takes a lot of energy to almost hide an emotion or hide emotions that we're ashamed of or feel guilty about. It takes a lot of energy just to put it somewhere and keep it there and not let it come up. And then sometimes it it permeates like a pressure cooker, and there's the smell comes out of the little spout, and we're like, oh, what's that? Oh, I feel angry, or I feel resentful, I feel I've been punched, I've been beaten up, I hate this, I don't like this, I want this to end. Oh, then we push it back down and carry on because of the caregiver duties, but just as much because of the feelings that are associated with even having those kinds of thoughts, like guilt, like guilt and self-reproach. So let's recap a little bit, folks, about some of the hidden emotions, thoughts, and experiences. These are all very common, and yeah, I see them more commonly in group settings where, like at Kensington and Wellspring, where in a peer support model, meaning caregivers support caregivers, right? And I just facilitate kind of the conversation and the support. They encourage one another or permission one another to share these emotions, like or resentment to their situation or to what's happening to their loved one or to what's happened to their life. Yeah, we are living longer, but are we really living healthier? And as we live longer, we're not that I'm saying we shouldn't be doing this, but we should be mindful of the supports and resources for it. Is that we're becoming more and more caregivers. Right? There's more and more caregivers because of the advent of illness as we're exposed to as we live longer. I don't necessarily think we're living healthier emotionally or physically. But anyways, that's a whole other topic, maybe for another time. Feeling cheated, right? Feeling and this aspect of not having what is felt is deserved, rightful, um, worked for, earned for their lives, right? They got cheated out of an aspect of their lives. And sometimes these emotions, folks, play into one another. The feeling of being cheated sometimes projected onto the disease or onto the person who has the disease, right? If you really sit with somebody, really get into some of the thoughts and feelings, and it's really permissioned, sometimes those pieces come out, right? And that's where the anger and resentment can set in. And then that leads to the experience of loss. We've had a whole session on grief and caregiving. The experiences of loss, which can also have aspects of anger, which can also feed into being cheated. I remember one caregiver saying, "I feel cheated," and she didn't actually use the word cheated. She implied it that even the time that she was spending in the group was time that she could be spending doing something else, but she felt she needed it because of her caregiver responsibilities. Right. So in a way, she was trying to say she felt cheated. Or at least that was my perception. There's also this, we talked a little bit about thinking of the future, right? Whether the person's recovering from cancer, stabilized with the cancer, living with the cancer, or dying from the cancer. We can't enter the future. Not everybody. I mean, some people can live completely in the moment. I can't. I've read all Eckhart Tolle's work, and I still live in the past and the future. And we plan. I plan for my life, for my parents, but then I get this feeling, and I've heard this from other caregivers. I get this feeling. Okay, so then when is that going to happen? Can I plan for it? What is my future? And then that feeling of uncertainty leads to a little bit of resentment and anger, and sometimes a feeling of being cheated. And then possibly an experience of loss, saying, I might have the full life that I've wanted. There's also aspects of self-sacrifice when we're caregivers. Some of us do it willingly. Some of us do it in a sense of duty and responsibility, and everywhere in between in terms of the continuum. And I hear from caregivers, if we in any way start to care for ourselves, which I will get to in terms of how we can do this, sometimes there's a feeling of betrayal. Quite often there's a feeling of betrayal if we have these feelings and respond to these feelings, such as being angry or feeling cheated or thinking about a future with or without the person. I've heard caregivers saying, "Oh, I feel like I'm betraying them. I feel like I'm cheating on them if I even think about a life for myself after this or before this or around this. And they feel like they're betraying the person they're caring for. Can you see how the feelings start to excuse me, how they're starting to interlace, right? And sometimes they can become a little complicated and intertwined, right? And I find, to have a place where those thoughts, experiences, and emotions, especially if they're repressed or hidden, to express themselves. And it could be in a professional therapeutic environment, but it can start in a setting where it's peer support, in a group setting, or even on one-on-one with somebody who provides caregiver support. We can start to unravel them and see where they fit and normalize them and address them and acknowledge them, right? One of the most common feelings besides anger is that feeling of guilt, and that's quite tied to betrayal. And that sometimes keeps the sacrifice in place, the self-sacrifice in place, and it kind of shrouds the feeling of being cheated. And if we do sometimes acknowledge some of these experiences and emotions as caregivers, it can be aspects of self-reproach. I can't believe I feel that way. How can I think that? The life they gave me life. They brought me to Canada. I got married and I got to do all my education and learning. He or she supported me. You know, um, this self-reproach is very common in caregivers, and that can lead back to self-denial, lack of self-care, repressed or suppressed needs, and into sacrifice, and oftentimes into caregiver burnout. And finally, folks, at the bottom, you'll see it's a repeating cycle. These aren't stages that we go through in caregiving. We sometimes circle between these, and there's a cycle to it, or maybe not even a circular cycle, but concentric, whatever that means, and cycle in and out of them. And I see that in groups because I've had the privilege and wonderful opportunity to have caregivers in groups for like 6, 7, 8, 9 months, a year, 2 years. And we see the repeated cycle of these experiences. But sometimes in those cycles, in those experiences, they become diluted if they have an ear, they have a space, an opportunity, a permissioning, an unconditional positive regard towards their receiving. Um, and they can dilute because they become normalized and become more in our conscious minds that they're a very normal part of of caregiving, normal part of being human, let alone COVID right now. I mean, all these emotions I've heard from people with COVID, right? But an interesting thing with COVID, right? Except when we start having political discussions on where and how it came to be, I don't want to get into that. When it's a foreign pathogen or something outside of us, and it's bad or whatever, right? It's almost okay to have the emotions, to be angry at COVID. How many times I've heard people say, "I'm done with COVID. I'm fucking done with COVID," right? Or COVID cheated me out of a summer or out of a job or out of education or a graduation, right? Um, and there can be that permissioning, but when it comes to caregivers, it's a very, very different story, very different story, and yet it's the same emotion, right? And what's important is because it's happening to us as caregivers, and not that it's not regardless of the what is the not necessarily the cause, but the representation of it, meaning why it's happening. But the fact that you're feeling it and experience it is the important piece. And that's where we need to acknowledge it. That's where we kind of have to separate it from the source, the situation, and look at it for what it is doing to us as caregivers, so that it doesn't necessarily remain hidden, suppressed, repressed, and unacknowledged and buried, because that can lead to lack of well-being, illness, and even mental health. Right? So here's some things. What can we do? I should have brought some water with me today. I get all excited about this, and I forget to provide self-care for myself. What can we do, folks? And these are suggestions that are in COVID times and what I've learned from supporting caregivers and myself. Okay. We're going to look at some of the self-care strategies. When I was talking to Susie about putting this together for Wellspring, I wanted to get away, folks, from the self-care strategies that we've heard over and over again. I don't necessarily feel are always that effective. They're more dissipations, right? For me, it's sometimes more deeper, more lasting, and sometimes harder work. Okay, even though not to add that on top of what caregivers do, but it's in the short term, so there are benefits in the long run. I want to get away from the fluffs. I mean, they work in their own regards, but they don't necessarily provide lasting resilience and support and stamina for caregivers. I'm going to talk about things that right now are actually provided for us by COVID, right? Because all those others are kind of tweaked and boundaried and subdued because of the pandemic and the restrictions that we have to do to safeguard our well-being. So let's talk about some of the self-care strategies that I think, in my humble opinion and experience, will support you in looking at these hidden emotions, these thoughts, and these experiences. I think one of the most paramount thing is to find a safe space. And I don't necessarily mean a safe room or the actual environment. I mean a setting. I mean a metaphorical, metaphysical space. Because it's not so much the space, but what the space affords you. Meaning somewhere, it could be people, it can be a group, it can be an organization, it can be a medium, and I'll get to that as well, where you feel unjudged if you were to tell your truest true about what it's like for you being a caregiver, right? Where the response would be unconditional, like looking, and I was going to say, I was just about to say, like looking yourself in the mirror. And I just realized I look myself in the mirror every day and I still have judgment and condition about, am I doing a good job with my family, right? With my parents. But somewhere where it can be received unconditionally, not necessarily supported, but not denied either, right? Not attacked, but not necessarily blowing sunshine on it, right? Like because pacifying and placates don't really actually work that well either, right? For caregivers, because they know their truth, they know what they're going through, they know what's hard, they know what they're feeling. For many of us, right? To have a setting or a space, and I'll expand a little bit more on what I mean by space, where we can feel where it feels right, not just emotionally, not just mentally, but physically in your body. You know, whether it's a group or the actual organization itself, like a Wellspring, but not to plug it, but unplugging it, where it just feels right for you, where it resonates, where the people in the group or the person you're speaking to one-on-one, you resonate with, you feel safe with, you feel you can trust them, where they're actually, like June Caldwell taught me, in that moment in time, literally like the Whitney Houston song, Moment in Time, like a moment in time where you feel you're truly being listened to, right? And when we feel we're being listened to, our authentic feelings about something can actually come out and alleviate. I've heard many times from caregivers, we do a lot of dissipation. Yeah, the latte, the bubble bath, the canoe trip, there's a lot of dissipation. But just like with any caregiver role, the tension builds up. And that self-care sometimes has to be in the moment itself, right? When we're providing the caregiving or shortly afterward. So these kinds of engagements are more than dissipation, right? The acknowledgement piece, the being listened to, the being focused on, right? Many times with caregivers, the feeling of being invisible. I'm caregiving for this person, I'm caregiving for this, I have to do this in the house, I have to do this for my family, I have to do this for my friends. There's nothing necessarily focused on you as a caregiver, but the safe space, there can be something unconditionally, unjudged, feeling right, focused just on you, or just on you for a moment, right? Where you can feel entrusted, and it's a space of confidentiality, because that is what, even unconsciously, through our fight or flight, through our biological threat responses, we are more willing to put forth that which is affecting us as caregivers, such as the emotions we talked about today. I feel you need this to express that which we spoke of, the hidden emotions, thoughts, and experiences. And this is permission, not by somebody else, folks. I'm highly advocating not by somebody else, but by you as a caregiver. Do you permission yourself? Do you allow yourself? I was talking to a caregiver a couple of days ago where they wouldn't permission themselves to, receive help or even talk about the fact that they have needs. It's the permissioning. And if it's challenge enough to permission yourself to ask for help, or to even receive it, or even to think about that you have needs, the permission you might need to to admit emotions to yourself, to another person, of that which we share today. Anger, resentment, feeling like a punching bag, feeling cheated, thinking about a future with or without the person. Those pieces, right? And I feel it's sometimes a subconscious, unconscious thing. Work around that, or how we can work around it, is to recognize what are the barriers that prevent us from having somebody listen, or seeking help in this particular aspect of caregiving, which is those hidden emotions. Is there a shame piece? Is there a guilt piece? Or is it the fact that we just don't feel like we should be having anything for ourselves as a caregiver? That leads to an awareness. I really appreciate the photo from this from lifemirror.net. She has some amazing photos, folks. Um, and with caregivers, these feelings and emotions, just to have an awareness of them, and to be able, whether to share them or not, we'll get to the parts about the mediums with which to share them, but to have an awareness that they do exist, that they live within us, that they can ebb and flow, right? Some days we feel angry and cheated, and some days they go away and we say grateful for the opportunity to give for somebody we care about. The main thing is to have awareness of them, to recognize what's happening with them, to give them, as June Caldwell did, presence. We don't necessarily have to do anything with them. This is not therapy. I'm not talking about therapeutic interventions. I'm not a therapist, but just to have awareness of them, and to recognize how they might even feel in your physical body. Guilt, shame, anger, resentment, cheated, they actually sometimes manifest in body sensations. And if we pay attention to, I watch this in caregivers. I'm giving it away a little bit, folks, for those of you who come to the groups, either by Zoom or when we used to have them in person. If you pay attention to body expressions, when we say certain things like that, especially if they're hidden or buried or repressed, the body reacts in a particular way. It means it's in the body, right? It's somehow having an interconnection with the body, even how it's expressed. And if we're even aware of that, sometimes the body itself can permission us to be aware of those experiences, those emotions, those thoughts. And then we find modes with which to express them, folks. Once we become aware of them, if we feel comfortable, we're a safe environment, and we permission ourselves, we find an avenue with which to express them, right? And we find a medium, right? It could be a multitude of mediums right now. Personally, I like writing. I like actually on trips. Sometimes I'll put my voice notes on, and I'll talk to myself, like almost doing therapy by myself. But I need a place to speak my truth, right? My truest truth about what it's like to be caregiving for two older adults, and I feel like I can't have a life, right? So much of my life is spent in this, and I just say it, right? There can be painting, there can be art, there can be music, there can be a number of apps online, there can be groups, there can be, as I mentioned, one-on-one support. Just find a medium, if you so choose, and permission, with which to give it life, right? So this doesn't stay with you. And when you give it life, it doesn't necessarily have to, and sometimes it actually can circumvent it being projected back onto the person you're caregiving for. That's an added benefit of caregiver support, folks. It actually makes you a better caregiver. Although I don't want to put that intentionality out there, because this isn't focused on the person you're caring for. This is focused on you, right? But if in some ways, and I have to do this sometimes, if some ways you want to play it in your mind so that it justifies the means, it actually makes you a more effective, more resilient, or it can make you a more effective, more resilient, more long-lasting, greater stamina as a caregiver, because you're taking care of you, right? And then following all that, there's this thought of reflection, right? I don't want to get too much into mindfulness and meditation. It's not necessarily my field. We have a great individual who facilitates that by the name of Marie. But the reflective piece is just taking that moment, to recognize what is actually happening with us when it comes to those hidden emotions, those hidden thoughts, and to see how it's even affecting our caregiving. The reflection piece is actually to see how it's affecting your caregiving. And this might seem like a lot of work and a lot of energy. Sometimes in the beginning, it can be, folks, but I can tell you that after a certain, even a short while, it becomes habitual. It becomes natural. The burden of those emotions, the energy they carry, right? The energy that takes to keep them down and not acknowledge them dissipates. And sometimes I've heard from caregivers that they actually feel more energetic and lighter and more active because they've been able to address those feelings, alleviate them, put them out there, and be able to support them. And if they are feelings that are, interlaced with experience of trauma, which I've had as a child, or they're really overburdensome folks, there are opportunities for interventions that are therapeutically focused that can actually support you in those experiences rather than you carrying this. Not necessary, but if it gets to that point, there's an avenue for that, or there's an opportunity for that, if again, if you so wish, if you permission yourself, if you're able to, and even if you can get out of the house, because some caregivers, as I know, can't even get out of the house for that moment. So during COVID times, this is what I'm trying to build within us, an uh, internal capacity with which we can support ourselves. Folks, I can't say this enough. I mean, I don't think hitting a person that you're caring for is normal. I don't think outward bursts of violence, aggression is necessarily normal, but the feelings can be, right? Caregiving is exceptionally tasking, as you know. I mean, I'm speaking to you folks as experts in this, right? The important piece is to normalize it. Let's normalize it. Let's not judge it. Let's harbor those emotions and garner the safe spaces and the opportunities with which to engage them, so that they don't lie dormant, so that they are normalized as an experience as a caregiver. And why I can speak to it in terms of normalcy is because of the peer support models, because of experiences with other caregivers. Everybody, all these caregivers, all saying different things at different times of the year, at different groups and different one-on-ones. There's got to be something to this. But the experience of caregiver support is so taxing that these feelings are quite normal in what happens to us. If we look at it of what's happening to the caregiver, which is actually not very common, right? We don't often look at what's happening to the caregiver, even within ourselves. I like to play with this a little bit. In the olden day, right? Maybe 200-300 years ago, we used to in many circles, in many communities, in many happens in parts of the world. We used to die as a community. We used to have much support around us. Society is a little